For years, Donald Trump was the force that unified Democrats and the biggest source of division within his own party. But as Republicans come together in Wisconsin this week to nominate Trump for a third consecutive election, the roles have been starkly reversed. Once again, the grand old party belongs to Trump. It did even before the assassination attempt this weekend. And the bonus news from Florida this afternoon that a federal judge has tossed out the classified documents case against him, which many thought was the strongest of all the cases. That only adds to the impression that his campaign is now unstoppable. It's an extraordinary transformation since his conviction last month, coinciding, as it does, with the doubts that surround Joe Biden and especially among Democratic donors.
I'm going to be completely honest, now is a difficult time to fundraise. The people that I generally speak to write 6 to 7 figure checks. So for them, it's almost a business decision. They want to look at the landscape and have a sense of certainty that President Biden is actually going to be on the ticket. And given the events of the past 2 weeks, I think, there's a tremendous amount of just anxiety and anguish over whether or not President Biden is the best candidate.
We'll talk tonight about the fallout from this weekend's events in Pittsburgh, how it changed the mood in Milwaukee, and whether Donald Trump can harness the moment on stage this week and be the unifier he hopes to be. Is it possible for someone so divisive to bring the country together?
The tone is changing. I mean, the tone of the country has changed. We were gearing up for a huge fight in November. We were picking sides. And then Donald Trump got shot or attempted to get assassinated. And then the country changed. The country's looking for unity. At a time there's a lot of uncertainty, and they're looking for a leader to portray strength. And in my view, that's certainly President Trump.
Miles Taylor, let me start with you, since you have worked with Donald Trump as part of the last administration. Brian there said that the former president feels like he'd been touched by an angel. Do you think he's capable of change and becoming the unifier in this campaign?
Well, look, I would say that if not an angel, then Donald Trump has had some extraordinary fortune over the past year politically. A year ago, Donald Trump was perceived by a lot of critics to be unnominatable. They thought he couldn't win the Republican nomination, that he was going to encounter fierce resistance. And of course, remember, almost a year ago, the investigation, the raid at his house concluded and found classified documents. He was facing mounting legal troubles. He was facing opposition within the Republican Party. And today he finds himself as empowered as a Republican presidential candidate has been in a very long time. Now, whether Donald Trump can unify the country is a big question for the general election and seems very unlikely given Donald Trump's history. But what we know this week is he has decisively unified the Republican Party, and that's what Democrats are going to see. They did not expect a unified GOP to be facing a fractured Democratic Party, but that's what the RNC this week is going to show us.
Yeah, politics is about events, Brian, and there's no question this was a big political moment at the weekend. Let me read you this from Peggy Noonan, the columnist for the Wall Street Journal. She writes today, when they trundled him off and he threw up his fist, pumped it at the crowd and shouted, "Fight," my relative said, well, that's over, meaning the election, meaning you don't give America an image like that and go on to lose. You give America an image like that and it enters political mythology forever. It's on the T-shirts, it's on the front of the Times, the front of the Time magazine. Brian, how significant do you think that one image will prove to be in this campaign?
I think many Democrats were already starting to make peace with the prospect of a second Trump term, even before the attack on Saturday. Given the last 2 weeks of debate about Biden, whether he's too frail and too old to remain president and to seek a second term in office, there was already a sense of inevitability, right, of Trump becoming the dominant figure in this race and the likely winner. Then comes the attack on Saturday and solidifies that feeling in many people's minds. I think the relative Peggy Noonan is quoting, it's just one of many who was thinking that on Saturday. But here's the X factor. We live in an environment of short-term memory loss. One of the reasons why Trump has been able to reestablish his dominance in the GOP is because people have forgotten about the Trump years, the chaos and the ugliness and the division. They've definitely forgotten about January 6th and the attack in Washington, D.C. So that idea of short-term memory loss may apply in this case as well. Will voters actually be thinking about the image, for example, from Saturday? Will they be thinking about the violence from Saturday when it comes to the election in November? That's an impossible question to answer. It's just not knowable yet.
Brian makes a really good point, Marianne. I mean, if you think back to some of the violent periods and episodes in American political history, and particularly back to 1968, you know, you had Robert Kennedy shot dead, assassinated, Martin Luther King assassinated in the same year, and the Democrats still went on to lose the election. So it doesn't necessarily follow that an incident like this leads to the defeat of the incumbent president.
I don't think there's an appropriate historical, or at least an accurate historical analogy for the likes of Donald Trump and this Republican Party. There may be a one or two Democrats in Washington that have titles, or some big donors who have big checkbooks who were already accepting a second Donald Trump term. That is not true for voters. It is not true for women across this country. And don't take my word for it. Look at the polls. When we were last all on together, the afternoon of the debate, which, you know, I have PTSD over, the polls that we went through that afternoon was 1 point, 2 points, 3 points. And yet, a week later, more polls come out, 1 point, 2 point, 3 points. Sunday, 3 polls came out, including Fox News. Trump up by 1, by 2, by 3. Now,
but it does look more complicated if you put in a third-party candidate, as I was saying to Lindy Lee in the last hour. It's more difficult then, and especially so in the 6 swing states.
Yeah, but I mean, I dealt with that with Clinton and Ross Perot. Everyone thinks that's just it's just going to happen. That's not a static fact. There was a highly sophisticated, targeted campaign approach that we had to take literally daily to push Perot voters towards Bush or push them towards Clinton. And it changed every single day. And in the end, it worked. So there are plenty of things to do here. I think the most important point here is I'm going to be most interested in the polling that comes after Thursday night, after this convention, after Donald Trump's nomination speech, and it will have been after the attack on him. What do the polls say then? I think we have that will be the true snapshot of what's going on, but no one is accepting a second Donald Trump term.
It's possible that it's just going to show a totally static race, that we're just going to be exactly where we were before the debate. And wouldn't that be incredible if that's the case?
Well,
then
here's a thought, though. Maybe, Miles, you could come in on this. Here's a thought, though. If this is a turnout election, which many people say it will be, what you now have is Republicans who are sitting on the fence starting to think, this has changed my mind. I'm going to vote now for Donald Trump. You've got Nikki Haley coming in tomorrow night. There's been a sort of a rapprochement with Nikki Haley, so some of the voters that she has will come across, Miles. And the problem has been for Joe Biden that he's not activating his base in just the same way.
Look, people want to be on the winning team. And I don't say that in favor of Donald Trump. Donald Trump and I certainly have no love lost between us. But I saw that this weekend in the wake of the attack with Republicans that I know very well, who are not big Trump supporters, who came out after the attack and said, I'm endorsing Donald Trump, or who expressed to me that they might consider a role in the next administration. This had an impact on their psyche. So while it may not have moved the mass of independent voters in this country, it may not move the needle significantly in those races. This was something Donald Trump was worried about. And Christian, you rightfully point to Nikki Haley. They were worried about those 20% or so of Republican voters that they could potentially lose because they stay home on Election Day. A lot of those folks are now going to get off the couch and they're going to go vote for Donald Trump. And we also saw that with the rash of endorsements on the internet from people who are sort of Republican adjacent or MAGA adjacent, business leaders and other people who maybe would have sat this election out, who now want to be on what they perceive to be the winning team. I think at least within the right side of the political spectrum, the conservative side, this is going to be very helpful for Donald Trump to bolster his numbers and get out his base.
We're going to talk plenty about Joe Biden after the break, but I do just want to focus on Donald Trump and this this change in emphasis that he's talked about in his interviews. I mean, the tenor of the speech he gives when he accepts the nomination, Brian, will change. Because it's a moment. People who might not have tuned in this week will watch because of what's happened in Pittsburgh. It's a chance for him to reset the impression they might have of him. He told the Washington Examiner last night the speech that he'd written was going to be a humdinger. Had this not happened, he wrote, this would have been one of the most incredible speeches. Honestly, it's going to be a whole different speech now. And you see that shift, Brian, already in the mail shots, in the campaign literature that they've sent out for fundraising since Saturday. They talk about unity, which is not a word you commonly associate with MAGA.
No, and I think in some ways when Trump uses the word unity, he uses it in a way that's very different than what we might think of as unity. Unity in the United States is impossible. Yes, they're called the United States, but unity is not possible. What we need to strive for is an absolute prohibition on political violence to be denounced by all sides, by everybody. And we've basically seen that, thankfully, in the last 48 hours. But we can't, he will talk about unity. For example, Politico is reporting that he met with RFK Jr. today, Robert F. Kennedy Jr., trying to seek RFK Jr.'s endorsement, trying to neutralize that third-party candidate. Trump would love to come out and present a unified right wing in the United States with Nikki Haley, right, Mitch McConnell, and Donald Trump and his VP J.D. Vance. But that's not actually unity. That's a performance. Trump's been very smart, by the way, with his performance. He has not been on camera. We've not heard him give speeches since the attack. He's building up the drama toward his big speech on Thursday night. But we have to wrestle with the reality here that we're talking about a man who was, grotesquely attacked on Saturday, but has also glorified political violence throughout his political career. This is complicated, and I think many voters know it's complicated. They recognize that Donald Trump doesn't promise calm and uniformity to the country. He represents a form of chaos, and that's still true, even though everyone's condemned what happened on Saturday.
No, you're absolutely right. We should absolutely remember his role in January 6th, his response to the attack on Paul Pelosi, House Speaker Nancy Pelosi's husband. David from Marianne asks in the Atlantic whether in denouncing violence, rightly so, we're at the same time extending an implicit pardon to the man who spread the most violent rhetoric in contemporary US politics. It's not a man, he says, without blame.
And yet that's pretty much what he asked for in his first post on Truth Social this morning, when he referred to the January 6th hoax, and we went through all of that. I think what I have found most interesting and revealing about the Trump campaign since Saturday in interviews that I've done and elsewhere, and you read it, is they're looking for you not to criticize Donald Trump in any way. And I think we can't go through a fact-free campaign. I think Joe Biden outlined how this should be done, which is if you have debates about policy, let's have them, whether it's on education, abortion, go down the list. That is fair game. But to do it in a respectful way, and you're not doing it as mortal enemies or inviting through your rhetoric violence. And I think that's going to be a tough wrestling match on the Trump side, likely, because that's where it's come from so far. And I would just add one other sign. I mean, I am hoping Thursday night and between then that Donald Trump does change his rhetoric. He went through a terrible event on Saturday, and hopefully that changes everything. But he picked J.D. Vance as his VP this afternoon, and J.D. Vance on Saturday was out there posting that this was all Joe Biden's fault. So I think there's a lot to deal with here, and it's hard to imagine we're going to turn the ship completely. But if there's a reduction in rhetoric and calms down, we'll all be the better for it.